to start with maybe a slightly lighter note than the one that we just had through Stuart's and then my follow-up just now. And that is that with Joe Biden now going to be installed in the White House, obviously things look a bit more optimistic for the Paris Accord and for actions on climate change. And in fact, our own Prime Minister Boris Johnson, when interviewed this morning about what was happening with the presidential election and in his happiness for Joe Biden that he achieved success, the first thing Boris Johnson mentioned when he said, "Where will we be cooperating with the United States?" was on climate change. Now, it may well have been a mistake. He may well have not been thinking, but I'd like to think it wasn't. And I'd like to think that maybe we can now stiffen his resolve and drive things forward faster in the UK and in other places and in cooperation with all countries, particularly with COP26 coming in 12 months' time. So on that note of optimism, I hand over to Mark McCaffrey for today's talk.
Thank you, Ed, very much. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Stuart, for the introduction. And I'm very happy to be here today. So just as on a technical note, have the other people that registered for this been let in from the waiting room, Ed? Okay, very good. So let me find my screen to share. Okay, just a second here, technical difficulties. Okay, apologies, I'm on a different computer than normal because of some problems that I've had, but thank you for bearing with me. Oh, where is it? Okay. So great to be here. And again, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon or this morning, or depending on where you are. I know some of you are on the Pacific coast of the United States, and it's very early morning there. I think there may be some folks from Asia attending this talk as well, but I'm very, very happy to be here today. And I think on a slightly more optimistic note from what Stuart shared, the situation is absolutely dire, and it is due to human activities, but there is much that we can do. And so I would like to present some ideas that myself and some colleagues have been working with over the past several years, and we sum it up under this sort of rubric, this paradigm of powers of 10. And I will explain in more detail what that is in a few minutes. But before I get into the details, a lot of what I'm presenting this afternoon is the work of myself and some colleagues, Abby Ruski from University of California at Merced, Avit Bomick from Karlstad University in Sweden, and Chad Freischman from Project Drawdown, along with Owen Gaffney, who is with the Future Earth program. So I will be referring in more detail to this paper that we published in the journal Environmental Research Letters a couple months ago, very shortly. But I think as an alternative title for the presentation this afternoon, I think we could think of this in terms of from person to planet in 10 steps, the 10 orders of magnitude between a single individual and the almost 10 billion people on the planet. And as we contemplate who we are as individuals, who we are as communities, who we are as nations, and who we are as global citizens, I'm hopeful that this framework can also help us in reimagining who we are as human beings. And so I'm eager to hear your feedback on these ideas. Hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss at the end of this call, at the end of this conversation. But I'd like to start with just a very brief overview of who I am in terms of the very short bio sketch. I was born in Boulder, Colorado in the United States back in 1955. And I currently live in a small village near the Slovakian border outside of Budapest, Hungary. I've been here for a little over 5 years now. And in 2016, I founded the United Nations Climate Change Community for Education, Communication, and Outreach Stakeholders, known as ECOS. And I won't give you my whole full resume and all the details of my CV and so forth, but I do want to express that I am more than the sum of these things that I've done. And, I'm certainly, a white male, elderly, vulnerable to COVID-19 and so forth. But one of the people who's influenced me over the years is this fellow, Ramana Maharshi, who really challenged us all through a process he called self-inquiry to think, to ask the question, who am I? Who am I really? Beyond just the ego, beyond just the labels that we identify ourselves with. And what he suggested is that through this process of self-inquiry, of asking who am I at a very deep level, we can actually come to understand that we are more than this litany of things we've accomplished and our family heritage and so forth, that actually on some level, like a lot of wise mystics and sages and so forth, he suggests that who I am, who we are as human beings, and who we are as sentient beings, you could say, is essentially like a cosmic consciousness, non-personal and non-ego-based awareness. And so that's much deeper than our ego identity, which tends to be very separate and divided and often based on fear of what's going to happen next, sort of our mortal preoccupation with who I am and what's going to happen to me. But obviously, sometimes we, and I'm using here the term in a number of different senses, we as human beings, we as individuals who are just wrestling with our own mortality, don't always appreciate that kind of big picture, that sort of cosmic consciousness, for a lot of different reasons. We live in a world where we have to engage on an everyday basis with family and friends and communities and politics and so forth. So just as Ramana Maharshi was encouraging us to inquire into who am I think we can also inquire into who are we as human beings. And, I think that especially when it comes to this issue of climate change, we need to be thinking about who is this we that needs to take massive climate action now. And I'm going to get into some numbers in a minute here to help us frame this in terms of who are these different we's that we're talking about. We have scientists, we have young people, we have people in the least developed countries of the world and so forth. And yet we also have this collective we, the global citizens. Joni Mitchell, the kind of famous Canadian songwriter, wrote in a song many years ago, we are stardust, billion-year-old carbon. We are golden, caught in the devil's bargain. And we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. And I've always liked that song. The song's actually Woodstock, for those of you who might remember it. But scientifically, this is true. We are stardust. All the carbon-based life forms are can trace our lineage back to the carbon that was formed probably on the order of 10 billion years ago, in the early days of the Big Bang. And so we are, in a sense, all connected that way to each other as human beings and to all other life forms. But let's focus for a few minutes just specifically on Homo sapiens. Who are we as humans as best we understand today? Because again, we keep using this term, we need to do this and we need to do that. And so who is this we in terms of humans? From the best research, we know there have been about 100 billion Homo sapiens who have ever lived. You know, we're the last of 5 lines of hominids. The rest went extinct or merged in with Homo sapiens. And we are somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years old, you know, depending on the research. So in any case, each of us individually can trace our lineage directly back to those first Homo sapiens somewhere in the order of 10,000 generations ago. And that to me, that's kind of mind-boggling. And of course, today we are also heading towards 10 billion people, meaning that roughly one out of every 10 people who have ever lived in all of human history, you know, going back to the Stone Age and before, are alive today. And of course, we've had exponential growth of population, especially since 1800. It's gone from 1 billion to close to 10 billion people. You know, we're closing in on 8 billion. We'll hit 10 billion probably by 2050. And we also have organized ourselves over these hundreds of thousands of years into tribes and communities, and more recently into cities and countries that vary in size pretty substantially. And, you know, we can look at our ancestry coming out of Africa, you know, somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years ago in different waves in going to different parts of the world. But in some ways, it's a very fractal-like pathway where we can actually trace through genetic tracing the different halogroups and so forth, and different language groups and so forth. I think fractals are a really interesting way of thinking about humans and other aspects of the natural world. But since we're focusing right now on humans and what it means to be humans, what it means to be a human being, I think the fractal metaphor is very powerful for us to be thinking of. You know, 30 years ago or so, Donella Meadows wrote an essay about if the global village were 1,000 people, what would it look like? What would the makeup be? And since then, that sort of metaphor has been updated. And today, basically, we can see that, you know, most of the planet is in Asia. There are 50% men, 50% women, although women tend to live longer than men. You know, 22% are overweight. You know, using the number 100 is very convenient because, of course, that's how we do percentages. You know, whether it's in public polling, which of course we've seen way too much of recently with all the obsession with American politics. But it's also interesting to know that, you know, 11% are undernourished, only 10% are Europeans, only 5% speak English, and 1 is dying of starvation while 1 consumes over 9 times the average amount of carbon energy, and 1 out of 100 own about half of the wealth in the world, which is another mind-boggling statistic. You know, we can also do this sort of analysis by countries, but one of the dilemmas with countries is that they vary in size, you know, from 2 countries that are over 1 billion people to tiny little countries like Malta, which are well under 1 million people. The average size of a country out of the 193 UN countries that signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is about 38 million people. But if you look at the bottom half of countries, half of them are smaller than 8.8 million, half of them are larger than 8.8 million. So in other words, the median is about less than 10 million. And we have more than 40 megacities of over 10 million people that are double the population. If you add up all those megacities, it's more than double the population of the bottom half of the countries in the world. So when we use these statistics comparing one country to another, oftentimes they're, comparing a pea with a watermelon, or, just to use a sort of a absurd metaphor. But these type of comparisons are often way off the mark and don't give us a clear sense of the scale involved. In fact, the top 5 countries in the world, India, China, US, Indonesia, and Pakistan, account for over half the emissions and half the global population. So we can also use this type of analysis to look at emissions, and the bottom half of humanity, in other words, half the people on the planet who don't have a lot of emissions, who are below the global average of around 6 tons of CO2 a year, they're responsible for only 13% of all the emissions. So when people talk about the population problem, they're often talking about this bottom half of humanity where the population is still growing, and yet they're responsible for very, very little of all the emissions. So I think we have to really keep that in mind. Yes, population is a concern. Yes, girls' education and family planning is incredibly important for tackling the problems that we face. But we need to really focus more on the middle 40% of emitters, and maybe especially on the top 10% of emitters. The top 10% of emitters are most of the people living in North America and Western Europe. And they are responsible, between those two for, 87% of all emissions. This is data from 2015 from Piketty and Chancel and an Oxfam report. And then of course the top 1% emitters are those who consume on an average annual basis 9 times this global average of 6 tons a year. In other words, over 56 tons a year, the 1% emitters, the top emitters are contributing to the problem. And they have a much further way to go to get to zero emissions, since that's really one of the goals of the Paris Agreement, is to get as close to zero emissions as possible. And of course, we're nowhere near there. The people who are in the bottom half of humanity are closer to that than most of us who are in that top 10% emitters category. So Oxfam has also updated their study from 2015 on carbon inequality. I would encourage you all to take a look at their new study that just came out, and their calculations showed that the top 10% are contributing 52%, more than half of all carbon emissions, with the top 1% contributing 15%. And so that top 1% is contributing more than half of the bottom 50%. Now, let's shift gears a little bit, just for a moment, away from this sort of percentage calculation, which, as I mentioned, can be misleading if you're not comparing equal size scale. And some of you may be familiar with a video that came out in the 1960s and then was updated in the 1970s called Powers of 10. They were looking at scaling in terms of spatial scale. And there's a great video still available on YouTube called Powers of 10, where they zoom in and out of different scales, starting with 1 meter, which would be 10 to the 0 power, 1 meter. And then they go on a kind of a fractal journey, zooming out to 100,000 million light years away, 10 to the 24th meter. And then they zoom all the way back to a subatomic nanoscale of 10 to the minus 16th meters. And there's been also some more recent versions of this Powers of 10 film. There's one called The Cosmic Eye. I would encourage you all to check out. These are very short, like 10-minute videos, but they're really engaging and inspiring to my mind. Again, they're looking at this issue of scaling using, in this case, meters. So several years ago, I was at a conference at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and we were talking about what do we need for social tipping points to help trigger deep decarbonization, rapid, radical, deep decarbonization, reduction of carbon emissions on a global scale. And I propose, since we were using these really vague terms, we were talking about national scale. Okay, well, nations vary in size several orders of magnitude. We're talking about local scales. Well, what does local mean? Local could be, my neighborhood. It could be, an entire big city. So we have to get away from using these really relative vague terms. And I proposed, why don't we use the 10 orders of magnitude between a single individual and the 10 billion people on the planet as a new kind of social framework. And so working with my colleagues, Avit Bhowmick from Karlstad University, and then some other colleagues I mentioned have joined us over the past couple of years, we developed this framework and have come up with a taxonomy, in other words, a series of labels, which again, the labels are going to vary because communities vary in scale, sometimes over several orders of magnitude, just like villages can vary in size and nations can vary in size. But to try to come up with a consistent way of using these as labels, we can talk about 10 to the 0 power, or 1, as P0, as Stuart Scott was mentioning. And I'm just going to walk you through these scales very quickly to give you a sense of how they're nested inside of each other. So I'm an individual, I'm nested within my family and close friends, and that I have a personal network. It's around 100 to 100, to a couple hundred people maybe, depending. Then I'm also nested within a neighborhood or village. This would be the P4 scale, a community scale of about 10,000 people, meta-community scale, 100,000 people, and so forth. Now, an interesting thing that I'll come back to in a minute is that the midpoint between a single individual and 10 billion people on the planet is actually, if we're looking mathematically, logarithmically, it's actually 10 to the 5th power, which is 100,000 people. And to me, this is a really interesting scale because it's kind of where people and planet and local and global converge. And some people call it the glocal scale, where local and global sort of are merged together. And it's the number of people that can fit into a large football stadium. It's roughly the number of people in arrondissement in Paris or a district in Budapest. Continuing on, we can zoom out to 1 million people of the urban scale, the nation or megacity scale of 10 million people, the subcontinental scale. This would be like 100 million people along the Nile River in Egypt and Sudan. The continental scale, Europe is roughly 1 billion people. The Americas are roughly 1 billion people. And then, of course, ultimately the global scale of closing in on 10 billion people. So just to review this taxonomy, this series of labels that we've come up with, you're going to be quizzed on this later, so you should be taking notes. I'm half joking on that. But in any event, again, there's sort of this potential sweet spot in the middle here around the scale of 100,000 people, or the P5 meta-community scale. And then again, we can also talk about all the humans who have ever lived, going back to who are we as human beings. That would be the P11 scale, 100 billion. Within the United Nations framework system, which is based on countries, 193 countries, there are this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. And we could also be thinking of common but differentiated responsibilities for each of these different scales. So we as individuals have certain responsibilities, as families we do, our communities do, our nations do, and so forth. But we also need to be realizing that this is not really necessarily a linear function, that in fact, these scales are very much all entangled together, to use sort of a concept from quantum social theory. We are very much entangled together, and some of these are very fractal-like in terms of their dynamics. So an individual can have an impact on a global scale, as we've seen from some of the recent examples of the work of a young Swedish teenager and how her actions had a huge ripple effect up to the global scale. And obviously not all the effects are necessarily good when you get people who are, acting on bad faith or have more power than they should have. But in any event, this is just a framework that we can be thinking about in terms of how we human beings are connected to each other in ways that maybe we don't even necessarily always think of. And again, I also want to emphasize this idea of sweet spots is not necessarily a particular geographical location that has all the great benefits of, not being so impacted by climate change or things like that. This is more of the idea that the sweet spots are the scales where we can have the best fit, the best, most optimal action around climate, addressing climate challenges. So this idea that maybe there's a local sweet spot between the global and the ultra local, the individual scale, has been something that we've been contemplating for several years now. And it was inspired by a talk by a researcher who was focusing specifically about carbon emissions and the idea that there's a regional sweet spot somewhere between the individual and the global scale. So this is where I'd like to just draw your attention to Project Drawdown, because this is a really important project that I was an advisor to. I first heard about Project Drawdown in 2014 and suggested that they use this as a project that could also, in addition to doing this analysis of all sorts of different approaches to deal with reduction of climate emissions and sequestering carbon through natural processes, I suggested it could have a very powerful educational potential, a way of education in the larger sense of the word, helping people not only in schools, but in communities think about what are the mix of solutions that would work best in their particular part of the world. If you'll just hold on a second, I need to try to close the window here. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Project Drawdown, please check it out, drawdown.org. And they published the Drawdown book in 2017. As I mentioned, I was an advisor on Project Drawdown. And so as we were thinking about this idea of using the Powers of 10 framework as a sort of tool for investigating whether or not there is in fact a sweet spot around the scale of 100,000 people, we decided to try to use some of the data from Project Drawdown to test this idea out. They looked at all the peer-reviewed research and all the relevant studies and literature on about 100 different solutions to reduce carbon emissions, sequester carbon through natural processes. And the term drawdown refers to the point when greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere start to decline. And as we all know, they're going up and up and up. But it's possible theoretically, and sooner or later it's going to happen, they will taper off and start to go down so that the natural processes, the natural sinks can start to soak up the carbon as they have been to some extent. But the natural processes have been overridden by the fact that we just keep pumping more and more greenhouse gases, mostly from burning fossil fuels, which are essentially buried solar energy. When we burn that buried solar energy Releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so the idea of drawdown is that we look at all these different sources of these greenhouse gases. We look at the natural sinks, and then we focus on what is it that remains in the atmosphere that we can try to reduce in a substantial way. So the drawdown system of systems, uses this very integrated model for looking at the different sources of greenhouse gases. And they, when I say they, I should include myself, since I was an advisor on the project. We looked at the different ways that we could electrify vehicles, we could shift energy sources, we could address waste and diets, we could use degraded land, we could focus on health and education, particularly around girls' education and family planning. We could address the issue of refrigerants, which are a very powerful super greenhouse gas. And one of the benefits of this drawdown approach is that it very much ties in with the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So drawdown has also updated its research since the 2017 data that was used in the book. And this is a graphic from their more recent focus. Reducing food waste is one of the key ways of reducing emissions. And this is something that we can all do in our everyday lives. About 30 to 40% of food, especially in the Western world, is wasted. And in some parts of the world, it's wasted in the fields because they can't refrigerate, they can't get it to market. Here in the Western world, most of that food is wasted in homes or in stores, where it just ends up in the garbage out the back door because of expiration dates and so forth. But so there's all these other mix of solutions that they have done all their due diligence and deep research into. This is what would work to get us to the 2 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement, and then to get to the 1.5, we would need to increase the focus on offshore wind turbines and utility scale solar voltaics. And so both of these are theoretically possible, but even getting to the 2C level would be very, very challenging. So I think we need to do all the above. In other words, we can't just look for the silver bullet of a plant-rich diet, for instance, or dealing with improvements of photovoltaics. We need to come up with a very integrated approach. And the thing is, different solutions will work in different communities and in different countries. So this is a summary of the data that we used in our study, the 2017 data, which found that food, including agriculture, the growing of food, dealing with food waste, moving towards a more plant-rich diet and so forth, that was the number one sector in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases that could be reduced, or the carbon that could be sequestered through regenerative agriculture and so forth. And then from energy was the second largest sector, land use, women and girls, particularly around girls' education and family planning and so forth. So I'll turn now to our paper and just share with you some of the findings of the paper, which is available through environmental research letters. If you just Google search powers of 10, seeking sweet spots, environmental research letters, you should easily find it. But
Mark, just to let you know, we really have about 5 minutes, maximum 10 left.
Okay, great. So I'm going to quickly just share through I'd like to share my screen again, study, which was basically taking the idea that, so anyhow, we all have, apologies for the technical difficulties. My computer battery ran out. And so in any event, I think that the take-home message that I'd like to share with you all today is that we found from our research that it's actually very much, almost every scale has things that you can do at the local scale, I mean, at the individual scale, at the family scale, but the big bang for the buck, so to speak, is at the community scale. That's where the largest number of climate solutions are accessible. Over $8 trillion of benefits can be found. And again, there's more detail about this in our paper in the environmental research letters. So between the 10,000 scale and million people scale is where we can focus more of our time. So if there is a missing link in our efforts, it's really at that scale. You know, people talk about all politics is local, and I think we should also be thinking the same when it comes to climate action. So climate action at scales that matter. You know, we need to move away from this obsession with focusing on nations solving all our problems for us, because they haven't done that over the past 30 years, even though they've committed to it. And I think it's time for us to take charge, take action, realize that we are the ones who will decide, are the ones who can implement, and we are the ones who can benefit. The Powers of 10 framework is being used already in education circles. It's being used in a book called You Matter More Than You Think by Karen O'Brien, which is bringing in quantum social theory into the challenge of climate change. Another book I would really recommend you all check out. So my message, final message to you, all of you, is that you and I are here in the center of the Powers of 10. This is the ultimate sweet spot right there in the center. And we collectively, as human beings, are all of this, all the human beings who have ever lived, the future generations. And let's not be too anthropocentric here. We can also include all of our relations, you know, all the other carbon-based all the carbon-based life forms that exist, and all the energy and matter that streams through our bodies. So I think with that, I would just leave you with this final concept of who I am is who we are. And again, thank you so much for the time. Contact me if you have any questions, and check out the blog where there's more ideas on this Powers of 10 framework. Back to you, Ed.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Mark. I think